Today we're going to talk about yeast, the origins of civilization or the Neolithic revolution, and the mythological rebellion of the gods or the cosmic war and dragon slayer motifs, as well as how all that documents the changing microbiota from nomadic lifestyles to settled or agricultural lifestyles. To begin, we have to clear up a common misconception, which is that humans did not begin farming cereal grains in order to bake bread. It was to brew alcohol. But the history of fermentation and beer making goes back even further. Neolithic fermentation predates agriculture. They discovered that certain fruit, honey, or cereal grains could be left in a jar and ferment. This process would give the food psychopharmacological effects. It was essentially a drug. I won't go too much into the effects of alcohol right now. All you really need to know is that it was a source of probiotics. It was highly nutritious. It allowed for the absorption of nutrients from the cereal grains that normally you wouldn't be able to get even from cooking, and that it was very communal and allowed for bonding. Understand that it was much different than the alcohol we have today. Their alcohol was a food source, it wasn't an accompaniment. The earliest permanent structures that humans made were these Neolithic sites. Nobody lived in these places. They were meeting spots or gathering spots for social events like festivals. Essentially, they were outdoor bar temples. For example, this is a large fermentation tank found at Göbekli Tepe, the oldest of these sites. Brewing equipment and fermentation vessels have been found all over the world at these Neolithic sites. This is another example found around Stonehenge. It's a mashing rake. They use this to mix all the ingredients that was used in the fermentation. Basically a big wooden fork, but it also suggests they were brewing in high quantities. I said that nobody really lived at these Neolithic sites, but I do imagine you had some sort of shaman or brewmaster who would be caretakers and who would start the fermentation and maybe overwatch it even. And in some cases, maybe they were permanent residents and probably the first ones to actually start farming. It makes sense that a group or class of people would have stayed behind to prepare the festivals, and these would have been your religious priestesses or shamans. This will come up again in a little bit, but most shamans were women. Hunter-gatherer and nomadic cultures tended to be more matriarchal. Many of these Neolithic sites, though, would eventually become sprawls. They would become farming communities. Once they learned how to sow seeds and start growing all the ingredients they needed for beer, they no longer needed to move around as much. And eventually those sprawls would grow in size and population and become cities. The locations of these earliest civilizations include climates and ecologies which support very high sugar content, fruit, and grains. So civilization was built in locations that allowed for an easy fermentation or that had high populations of this yeast. The species of yeast is mainly S. cerevisiae, what we call brewers or bread yeast today. The oldest origin of this yeast actually comes from China and seems to have spread very rapidly around the world. This yeast, S. cerevisiae, is the first eukaryote to have its entire genome sequenced. However, that's just the modern domesticated version of it. The wild yeast that it comes from still has a lot of mystery around it, but researchers have been studying the origin of this yeast and its use in fermentation. So humans begin to consume this probiotic food source, and it starts to initiate changes in the microbiome. This affects what we're able to digest, the immune system, and the development of the brain. Now, obviously, we're not a different species. They weren't that big of changes, but it was enough that we settled and civilization began. So we might say that they built temples around these locations of fermentation, and then eventually cities were built around those temples. Humans worship or revere what is good for them and fear what is bad for them. They began to personify these sublime forces of nature, and then they personified those forces as gods. So from these early civilizations, these settled humans, we get a certain kind of mythological motif, which we could call the rebellion of the gods. They were cosmic war events, such as the Titanomachy. These usually culminated in the dragon slayer motif, where one of the younger gods dueled one of the primordial older gods, such as Zeus and Typhon, or Ra and Apophis, or Marduk and Tiamat, or Indra and Vritra, Thor and Jormungandr, Heracles and the Hydra, even Michael the Archangel and Lucifer. And there are dozens of other examples around the world that we could list. It's by far one of the oldest tales that we have. The conclusion of this usually led to civilization and finally the gods granting humans the gift of beer. And that's why to this day, still almost every single festival, holiday, or religious ceremony or sacrament involves alcohol and yeast in some way. But there's a very important distinction between the microbiota of an agricultural human and a hunter-gatherer human. The diseases and health issues between these two groups are very different. One of the biggest differences is chronic and immune system issues are almost unheard of in hunter-gatherers. Yet they were susceptible to many different environmental parasites and bacteria that could cause disease, whereas those same parasites may not be pathogenic to someone living in a city. The microbiome has a different composition, and that builds a different kind of immune system. Hunter-gatherers are generally free from allergies and chronic issues. They've also found that every season the microbiota changes within nomadic lifestyles, meaning they had like a winter microbiome versus a summer microbiome that helped them with their chemicals and hormones and digestion. Hunter-gatherers are generally free from anxiety, depression, and various other issues like that. As a side note, I do think that's why seasonal mood disorders, seasonal allergies, and seasonal colds are so common in our modern lifestyles. But the point is, not all the same health issues are shared between hunter-gatherer humans and settled humans. However, these cosmic war motifs are ongoing. In these ancient cultures, diseases was related to the kind of offspring or children of the different primordial gods. These would become your evil spirits and your demons and such. This change in the microbiota was the rebellion of the gods. The microbiota of these fermented foods took over many of the old microbiota of humans. The masters of game changed, and this led to a different kind of culture. These rebellion of the gods and dragon slayer motifs are also thought to be symbolic of the kind of decline of matriarchal societies. This is most obvious in the battle of Marduk and Tiamat. Again, when Marduk is victorious, he gives beer to humans. Despite this, brewmaking was still the responsibility of a woman and was usually under the protection of a goddess. A common wedding gift given to a bride was fermentation equipment. They even passed down cultures of yeast. Whether it was a vessel or a stick or a stirring rod or a yeast ring, they would pass down these cultures of yeast. It was a very ancestral practice, but it was also how you helped to guarantee a good fermentation. This also caused genetic changes in these yeasts. That's why we have a difference between domesticated and wild yeasts. They sort of became catered to that environment, to that food source, and to those people. So brewing was one of the most important religious practices around the entire world. The responsibility was given to women probably because of that shamanic tradition. This would be the case up until around the 1500s, when brewing would then become mainly associated with men. And this actually happens through the sort of demonization of witches. All the stereotypes associated with witches were actually because they were brewmasters. The cauldron and the broom were used in fermentation. But this shows us that these magical, spiritual practices associated with brewing and yeast maintained for thousands and thousands of years up until very recently. Specifically for cultures like Sumeria and Babylon, beer was their currency, it was also their religion, their spirituality, and their food source. It was also medicine and community. In medieval times, monasteries would start to make beer. So alcohol was a divine drink. It connected you to your ancestors, it built your community, and it healed you. It was very medicinal as well. They also put all kinds of psychedelic plants and spices in it. What you can do with microbial fermentation is basically endless. So it's unfortunate that today our alcohol has been sanitized. It no longer is nutritious, it's now just a drink rather than a food source. It's lost its medicinal qualities, its probiotic qualities, it's filtered of all its yeast, and so there's no connection to any ancestors. But yeah, I guess that's enough for now. I could probably go on for hours about this stuff. There's also a lot of details I glossed over, and there's just so much to this, but yeah, that's enough for now. Thanks for watching.